When we think about the story of Jesus coming into the world, we usually look for familiar things. We look for a manger. We look for shepherds keeping watch in a field. We look for a star over Bethlehem, angels singing in the night sky, and a young mother traveling to a crowded town. The other gospel writers give us exactly what we expect. Matthew begins his account with a long genealogy. He traces the family tree of Jesus all the way back to Abraham. He grounds the arrival of the Messiah in Jewish history, proving his royal right to the throne of David. Luke begins with a detailed birth story. He gives us the census of Caesar Augustus, the wrapped cloths, and the feeding trough. He roots the story in the soil and politics of the first century. Mark begins with a wild prophet named John the Baptist, shouting in the Judean wilderness. All three of them start their story somewhere on earth. But the Gospel of John does something entirely different. John ignores the manger. He ignores the shepherds. He bypasses the Roman Empire, the city of David, the genealogy of Abraham, and the entire human race. Instead, he steps completely outside of time. He opens his gospel with a sentence so famous that we often read it like soft religious poetry. He writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." We are so used to hearing those words read in church that we miss the collision they caused in the ancient world. John is taking his readers all the way back to the opening line of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Before there was light, before there was gravity, before there was matter, or space, or time. And what does he place there? In the dark, silent eternity before creation, he does not place a silent energy. He does not place a blind, unthinking cosmic force. He places a word. In English, the term word sounds small. It sounds like vocabulary, a unit of speech, something you find printed in a dictionary or spoken in a casual sentence. Calling a person the word feels almost abstract to modern ears. But John was not writing in modern English. He was writing in Greek. And the specific Greek term he used is logos. John did not choose this term because it sounded beautiful. He did not choose it to write a poetic introduction before getting to the real story. He chose it because, in the first century, logos was one of the most explosive and controversial words he could possibly use. It was a loaded weapon. To understand why John skips the traditional birth story and starts his gospel before time began, we have to realize something crucial about the world he lived in. John was not introducing a brand new, unheard of concept. He was picking up a word that the ancient world was already obsessed with. Both the Jewish scholars in Jerusalem and the Greek philosophers in Athens had deep, burning convictions about what the Logos was. They had been debating it, writing about it, and searching for it for hundreds of years before John ever picked up a pen. John steps into that crowded intellectual room, raises his hand, and essentially says, "I know the secret you have all been searching for, and it is not what you think." To understand the sheer weight of what John is claiming, and why this one word changes everything about how we see Jesus, we have to look first at the Greek minds he was writing to. By the time John wrote his gospel toward the end of the first century, the physical world was dominated by the Roman Empire, but the mind of the world was dominated by the Greeks. Greek was the language of the streets. It was the language of the marketplace, the language of education, and the language of philosophy. For 500 years before Jesus was born, Greek thinkers had been looking up at the night sky and asking a profound question. They looked at the stars and saw patterns. They watched the changing of the seasons and saw perfect, predictable cycles. They looked at the natural world and saw mathematics, symmetry, and logic. And they asked, why? Why is there order instead of chaos? Why does the universe make sense? What keeps the physical world from falling apart? The great philosophers concluded that behind the physical world, there had to be a supreme, invisible principle of reason. There had to be a rational mind that governed the cosmos, an ultimate reality that served as the invisible glue of the universe. They needed a word for this divine organizing force, so they called it the Logos. For centuries, Greek schools of thought, especially a group known as the Stoics, taught that the Logos was the highest reality. It was the reason why anything existed at all. But there was a catch. To the Greek mind, the Logos was completely impersonal. It was not a God who knew your name. It was not a being who could hear your prayers, feel your sorrow, or care about your suffering. The Logos was a cold, distant, unfeeling force. It was like gravity or time, powerful, necessary, and entirely indifferent to you. So, imagine a first-century Greek reader unrolling the scroll of John's Gospel for the very first time. They read the opening line. In the beginning was the Logos. Their eyes would widen. Their heart would skip a beat. John is looking directly at the Greek-speaking world, acknowledging their deepest intellectual search, and saying, "You are right. You are right to look at the universe and see design. You are right to believe that the world is not an accident. You are right that there is an ultimate logic holding all things together. I know the force you have been searching for." But then, in the very next breath, John does something that would completely shatter their philosophical system. He writes, "And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God." John takes their cold, distant, impersonal force and gives it a face. He tells them that the ultimate reality of the universe is not a blind principle. It is not an abstract mathematical equation. The Logos is a person. The Logos has a will. The Logos has a relationship. The Logos has a life. With one brilliant sentence, John captures the imagination of the entire Greek world. He takes their highest philosophical achievement and points it straight at Jesus of Nazareth. If John had stopped there, it would have been a masterpiece of communication. But John was not Greek. He was a Jewish fisherman who grew up steeped in the Hebrew scriptures. And while the Greeks heard the invisible glue of the universe in the word logos, John's Jewish readers heard something completely different. For them, this word was not a philosophical theory. It was a memory. It went back thousands of years, to the darkest, quietest moment in history. To understand what John was really doing, we have to leave the philosophy of Athens and go back to the theology of Jerusalem. We have to look at how a first-century Jew heard the exact same word. And that is where the story gets even deeper. While the Greek philosophers were looking at the stars and searching for the invisible glue of the cosmos, the Jewish people already had a vocabulary for how the universe was held together. If you walked into a first-century synagogue and said the phrase, "In the beginning," every person in the room knew exactly where you were going. You were taking them to the first scroll of Moses. You were taking them to Genesis chapter 1. But when a Jewish mind thought about the beginning of the world, they did not think of a cold, impersonal equation. They thought of a voice. In the Hebrew scriptures, when God creates, He does not struggle. He does not go to war with rival gods in the heavens. He does not carve the mountains with tools. He speaks, "Let there be light." And there was light. In Hebrew, the primary term for word is davar. But to an ancient Israelite, davar was not just a grammatical unit. It was not just a sound made by the vocal cords. In the Hebrew imagination, the word of God is a force. It is active. It is dynamic. It accomplishes things. When God speaks, His word has the power to alter reality. We see this throughout the Old Testament. When the prophets receive a vision, they often say, "The word of the Lord came to me." The word arrives almost like a distinct presence. Psalm 33, verse 6 summarizes this perfectly. "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of His mouth." The word is God's power moving out into the darkness and bringing forth life. This idea became so important that in the centuries leading up to the time of Jesus, it developed even further. Jewish scholars began translating the Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic, the everyday language of the people. These public translations and paraphrases were called the Targums. When these ancient scholars came to passages where God was interacting directly with humanity, they were careful. God is holy, invisible, and transcendent. So they often used a specific Aramaic term as a stand-in for His presence on earth. That term was Memra, which simply means the Word. If the Old Testament said that God saved His people, the Targums might say that the Word of God saved them. To the first-century Jewish mind, the Word was how God revealed Himself. It was how He made contact with humanity without consuming them in His infinite glory. So when John writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," he is executing one of the most brilliant theological moves in human history. He is standing directly on the bridge between two entirely different worlds. He looks to the Greeks and uses their ultimate philosophical term, logos. He tells them that the rational order of the universe they have been searching for actually exists. Then, he looks to the Jews and fills that exact same term with the memory of Genesis. He tells them that the active, creating voice of God, the Memra, the Devar, was there before time began. In a single opening sentence, John has captured the highest peak of Greek philosophy and the deepest root of Hebrew theology. He has everyone's absolute attention. Both the philosopher in Athens and the rabbi in Jerusalem are leaning in, hanging on his next sentence. He has united their worlds perfectly. But he does not leave them there. Just a few verses later, John is going to write something that will shatter their expectations entirely. He is going to drop a theological bomb that would deeply offend the Greek mind and completely stun the Jewish scholars. He takes the eternal, pure, invisible word of the cosmos, and he brings it crashing down into the dirt of human history. If you were a Greek philosopher in the ancient world, you believed in a strict division between two realms. There was the realm of the spirit, and there was the realm of the physical. The spiritual world was pure. It was perfect. It was the home of reason, mathematics, and the logos. But the physical world was entirely different. Matter was heavy. It was corrupt. It was decaying. Flesh gets sick. Flesh bleeds. Flesh grows old and dies. To the Greek mind, the human body was a prison. The ultimate goal of religion and philosophy was to escape the physical world, to shed the corruptible body, and to let your mind ascend back into the pure realm of the spirit. So, when John writes his opening lines, the Greek readers are completely with him. The Logos is eternal. The Logos is God. Yes, they would say. This makes perfect logical sense. But then, in verse 14, John writes a sentence that would have felt like a physical blow. He writes, "And the Word became flesh, and made his dwelling among us." In Greek, the word for flesh is sarx. It does not mean a glowing, perfect, angelic body. It means meat. It means skin and bone. It means sweat and vulnerability. To the ancient Greek mind, this was not just a strange idea. It was offensive. Why would the pure, invisible, perfect Logos ever choose to wrap itself inside the decaying prison of human flesh? It went against centuries of intellectual achievement. And to the Jewish readers, it was just as shocking. The Jews knew that God was holy. He dwelled in unapproachable light. When God spoke from Mount Sinai, the mountain shook, lightning flashed, and the people were terrified. They begged Moses to tell God to stop speaking directly to them, because they thought the raw power of his voice would kill them. The creating word of God was too powerful, too holy, to be contained in a human frame. But John does not apologize for the collision. He leans into it. He is telling the world that the ultimate reality of the universe did not stay at a safe distance. He did not just shout instructions from the heavens. He did not just send a prophet, or a vision, or a sacred text. The Creator looked at a broken, decaying, bleeding world and decided to step into it. He took on the very thing the philosophers despised. He became tired. He became hungry. He allowed himself to experience grief, rejection, and ultimately, death. Most ancient religions taught that humanity must find a way to climb up to God. We must meditate enough, or be good enough, or suffer enough to escape this world and reach the divine. But John says the exact opposite. God climbed down. He became flesh, and he lived among us. But this is where John does something even more brilliant. When he writes the phrase "lived among us," he does not use the ordinary Greek word for living in a house. He does not use the word for renting a room or settling down in a village. He uses a very specific, unusual verb to describe how Jesus existed in the world. And if you know your Old Testament history, this one word suddenly illuminates the entire purpose of the incarnation. Because John is taking his readers out of the realm of philosophy and dragging them straight back into the dusty wilderness of the Exodus. After the Israelites were freed from Egypt, they walked into a harsh, empty desert. They were a wandering people, and God wanted to dwell in the middle of their camp. But there was a problem. God is entirely holy. His presence is described as a consuming fire. How does the infinite, burning purity of the Creator live in the middle of a broken, rebellious, and fragile people without overwhelming them? God gave Moses a solution. He gave him the blueprints for a tent. It was called the Tabernacle. For hundreds of years, this movable tent was the center of Jewish worship. It was the physical location where the space of God and the space of humanity overlapped. When the tabernacle was finally finished in the book of Exodus, the text says that the glory of God descended like a cloud and filled the tent. The presence was so heavy, so intense, that even Moses could not go inside. The tabernacle was not just a building, It was the absolute focal point of God's presence on earth. Now, keep that image in your mind and listen again to the second half of John chapter 1, verse 14. In English, most of our Bibles read, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." The word dwelling sounds ordinary. It sounds like moving into a neighborhood, settling down, or building a house. But John did not use an ordinary word for living in a house. He used the Greek verb eskenosin. Literally translated, it means to pitch a tent, to tabernacle. John is saying, the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. For a first-century Jewish reader, that sentence is an earthquake. John is taking the most sacred, holy, unapproachable reality of the Old Testament, the presence of God in the tabernacle, and saying that it has now moved into a human body. Jesus is the ultimate tent of meeting. He is the exact location where heaven and earth finally touch. The old system of the tabernacle, and later the stone temple in Jerusalem, was not bad. It was not a mistake. It was a beautiful, necessary shadow. It was a sacred pattern preparing the world for the ultimate reality. But shadows are meant to give way to the substance. The glory of God no longer dwells behind a heavy veil in a tent of animal skins and woven fabric. The glory of God has wrapped itself in human skin. Notice what John says immediately after this. He writes, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." In Exodus chapter 40, the glory of God was so terrifying that people had to stand back. But John says, "We saw it. We touched it. We ate meals with it. We watched it walk the dusty roads of Galilee." The ancient Greek philosophers were searching for an abstract, invisible logic to explain the stars. The Jewish scholars were studying the ancient texts, waiting for the heavy glory of God to return to the temple. And John says to both of them, "He is here. The Word is a person, and he moved into our neighborhood." This one word, eskenosin, is not just a clever historical reference. It is the key that unlocks the entire architecture of the story. Because once you understand that the eternal Logos has pitched his tent in the dirt of human history, it changes how you read every single page of John's Gospel from chapter 2 onward. Once you realize that the eternal Word has pitched his tent in a human body, the rest of John's Gospel reads completely differently. If you pay close attention, you will notice something fascinating about how John describes the ministry of Jesus. In the other Gospels, when Jesus heals someone or calms a storm, the writers often use the Greek word dynamis. It is where we get the word dynamite. It means an act of power or a miracle. But John rarely uses that word. Instead, he chooses a different word. He calls the miracles of Jesus signs. A sign is not an end in itself. A sign is a marker. It exists to point your eyes toward a larger reality. John records exactly 7 of these miraculous signs before Jesus goes to the cross. And if you look closely, they are not random acts of kindness. They are carefully chosen events designed to prove the opening sentence of the gospel. They are meant to show us that the voice that spoke the universe into existence is now speaking on the dusty roads of Israel. Look at the very first sign in chapter 2. Jesus is at a wedding in Cana, and they run out of wine. Jesus does not perform a long ritual. He does not ask God to send a miracle down from heaven. He simply looks at the servants and tells them to fill 6 stone jars with water. Then he tells them to draw some out. By the time the water reaches the master of the banquet, it has become the finest wine. This is not a magic trick. This is the Logos interacting with the physical world. The creating word gives a silent command, and the molecules of water simply obey their maker. Or look at chapter 9. Jesus meets a man who has been blind since birth. Notice how Jesus heals him. He spits on the ground. He makes mud with the dirt. He takes the clay and spreads it over the man's broken eyes. To a Greek philosopher, this is disgusting. The divine Logos getting his hands dirty in the mud. But to a Jewish reader, this is breathtaking. It is a direct echo of Genesis chapter 2. God formed the first human from the dust of the earth. Now, the Word made flesh is standing in the dirt, recreating what is broken. He is acting as the creator, finishing the work of the original garden. But the clearest proof comes in chapter 11. A man named Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. His body is sealed inside a stone tomb. The decay has already begun. Jesus stands outside the tomb. He does not perform a ritual. He does not recite a long religious incantation. He uses the exact same mechanism of power that was present in the dark silence before time began. He speaks. He cries out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man walks out into the light. This is not just a prophet with a gift of healing. This is the Hebrew Memra. This is the active, dynamic voice of God that brings reality out of the void. Just as the Word spoke into the darkness of Genesis chapter 1 and said, "Let there be light," the Word speaks into the darkness of the tomb and says, "Let there be life." John has brilliantly shown us the hands of the Creator at work. He has shown us the Logos acting in the physical world, bringing order out of chaos, light out of darkness, and life out of death. But the pattern does not stop there. John does not just show us the Creator's hands. He lets us hear the Creator's voice through a very specific phrase. It is a phrase that Jesus repeats exactly 7 times. And that phrase takes us all the way back to a burning bush in the wilderness. When John tells the story of Jesus, he pays very close attention to what Jesus says about himself. In the Greek language, if you want to say the phrase "I am," you usually only need to use the verb. The pronoun is already built into the word. You do not need to add the word "I." But sometimes, a speaker wants to create a massive, unmistakable emphasis. They want to draw absolute attention to their identity. When that happens, they use both the pronoun and the verb together. In Greek, that heavy, emphatic phrase is ego eimi. Literally, it means I, myself, am. To a Greek philosopher, this was just grammar. But to a first-century Jew, this specific phrase was not just grammar. It was sacred. It was a phrase that carried the weight of history, because it took their minds straight back to the desert of Midian, to the most important conversation in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses is standing barefoot in the sand. He is staring at a desert bush that is burning, but is not being consumed by the flames. A voice speaks from the fire, telling Moses to go back to Egypt and free the Israelite slaves. Moses is terrified. He asks the voice a simple question. "If the people ask me who sent me, what name should I tell them?" The voice from the burning bush answers, "I am who I am." Centuries later, when Jewish scholars translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, they had to decide how to translate that holy, unpronounceable name. They chose the phrase ego eimi. From that moment on, in the Greek-speaking Jewish world, those words were reserved for the divine. They represented the uncreated, eternal, self-existent nature of God, the one who depends on nothing else to exist. Now, watch what Jesus does in the Gospel of John. He does not just perform 7 miraculous signs. He makes 7 profound declarations using this exact sacred phrase. He feeds a massive crowd in the wilderness. And then he says, "I am the bread of life." He stands in the temple courts during the Festival of Lights, and he says, "I am the light of the world." He looks at the outcasts and the marginalized, and he says, "I am the door, and I am the good shepherd." He stands weeping outside the stone tomb of his friend, and he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." He comforts his confused disciples on the night before he dies, and he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He prepares them for his departure, and he says, "I am the true vine." With every statement, Jesus is taking the holy name of God from the burning bush and attaching it to the deepest needs of the human soul. But he goes even further than that. In John chapter 8, Jesus is locked in a fierce debate with the religious leaders. They are questioning his age, his authority, and his sanity. They point out that he is not even 50 years old, yet he claims to have seen Abraham. And Jesus looks at them and says something that makes them immediately pick up stones to kill him. He says, "Before Abraham was born, I am." Notice the phrasing. He does not say, "Before Abraham was, I was." He bends time. He uses the eternal present tense of the wilderness fire. The Greek philosopher believed the Logos was an unmoving, unfeeling, distant force. The Logos does not know your name. The Logos does not care if you are a slave in Egypt or a mourner weeping outside a tomb. But John is showing us a completely different reality. The word that holds the universe together is the exact same God who heard the cries of the slaves, who split the sea, and who fed his people in the desert. The creating word and the rescuing God are the exact same person. All of this builds to one final, unavoidable conclusion. If the Logos has pitched his tent among us, and if he speaks with the eternal voice of the burning bush, It changes the fundamental answer to the most important question a human being can ask. If the Logos has a face, and if that face belongs to Jesus of Nazareth, then the universe is not an empty, echoing room. For centuries, human beings had been trying to figure out what was hiding behind the veil of the cosmos. The Greek philosophers looked at the stars and decided that the ultimate reality was a pure, unfeeling mind. A cold, distant logic that kept the planets turning but cared nothing for human suffering. Other ancient cultures looked at the unpredictable weather, the famines, and the wars, and decided the universe was run by angry, chaotic gods who had to be constantly appeased. Even the Jewish people, who knew the true God through the covenants and the prophets, knew that God was so holy that seeing him directly meant certain death. The glory was real, but it was hidden behind a thick curtain in the temple. God was there, but he was veiled. But John closes his opening prologue with a sentence that removes the veil forever. In John chapter 1, verse 18, he writes, "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." The Greek word John uses for the phrase "made him known" is fascinating. The word is exegesato. It is the exact word from which we get the English term exegesis. In the ancient world, it meant to unfold a complex document, to narrate a story in full, or to carefully explain the deep meaning of a text. John is telling us that Jesus is the exegesis of God. Jesus is the full explanation of the Father. Before the incarnation, humanity had the words of the prophets. They had the laws, they had the shadows, the sacrifices, and the patterns. But shadows can only tell you the outline of a person. They cannot show you the expression on their face. John is saying that if you want to know what the creator of the universe looks like, you do not need to stare at the stars or study abstract philosophy. You just look at Jesus. If you want to know how God reacts to religious hypocrisy, watch Jesus clear the temple courts. If you want to know how God responds to human grief, watch Jesus stand outside the tomb of his friend and weep. If you want to know how God treats the outcast, watch the Word made flesh wash the dirt off the feet of his disciples. The ultimate reality of the universe is not a mathematical equation. The organizing principle of the cosmos is not a blind, unfeeling force. The gravity that holds all things together is love. And that love has a heartbeat. It has a voice. It has scars on its hands. When John chose the word logos in the very first sentence of his gospel, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was standing in the center of the ancient world, gathering up the deepest philosophical questions of the Greeks and the oldest theological memories of the Jews, and pointing them both to a carpenter from Nazareth. He was telling us that the meaning of life is not a puzzle you have to solve. It is not a mystical state you have to achieve by escaping your physical body. It is a person you are invited to know, because the Word did not just shout instructions from the safety of heaven. He stepped down into the dust. He pitched his tent in the middle of our broken, decaying world, and he stayed until the work of redemption was finished. If this journey through the opening of John has helped you see the text with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss our next deep dive into Scripture. Because John was right. The Word was never just a philosophical concept. It was the shape of God's heart, walking onto the human stage.